Hello and welcome. My name is Kara Cook. I'm the Climate Change Program Coordinator for the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Agriculture and Climate Change, as part of the Green Bag Lunch Green Tea webinar series. This webinar series is dedicated to discussing the health implications from food and agriculture and is held on the first Monday of the month at 12 p.m. Pacific Time. Please save the date for the remaining webinars in the series. October 7th, Food as Medicine, November 4th, Contaminants in Food, Right to Know, and December 2nd, Institutional Food Purchasing. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items. We will take questions at the end of the presentation. You can enter a question during or after the presentation by entering it into the chat box at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. This webinar is also being recorded, and the link will be sent out to those who registered for the webinar, as well as placed on the ANNI website. We will be offering one nursing continuing education for viewing the webinar. A link to complete an evaluation form will be sent out by email tomorrow, and you must complete the evaluation to receive the continuing education. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Barbara Sattler, ANNI board member, professor at the University of San Francisco, and an international leader in environmental health and nursing.
Thank you, Kara, and I'm delighted that so many of you are joining us today with your interest in this area. I know that some of you have been to all of our webinars so far, and we're hoping that these are helping to both inform and motivate you to be making positive changes where you are living and working and or going to school. And so I'm going to quickly kind of put an overview of climate change, sort of front-loading this conversation with some explanation of that. And I do this fairly regularly just to kind of get our nursing colleagues to feel comfortable talking about climate change in really simple kind of talk to your neighbor terms. And then we're delighted to have Renata with us. So, and I'll introduce her. So for all of human history, and certainly before that, the Earth has been staying at a temperature that's allowing the flora and fauna on Earth to flourish. And it's been doing this because our climate has been relatively stable. And one of the reasons for that is the sun's rays heat up both the oceans and other water bodies and the land masses. And some of that heat then gets reflected back out. And historically, it's been able to go right out beyond the atmosphere. And that way of some of the heat coming in and some of it dissipating out has allowed us to stay in a homeostasis as the Earth that, once again, has allowed us to flourish. But what we have been having over the last 100 years or so is we've been having this phenomena where we are covering the Earth with this sort of blanket I'll explain in a minute. And it is giving us a phenomena that's a lot like when you leave a car in a parking lot on a sunny day. And this time lapse is an actual time lapse was done where it was 80 degrees outside, but this car that was left in the midday sun, just 10 minutes, it rose to 99 degrees. And I'm showing you this because this is a bit like what's going on right now. What's going on is we have this sort of blanket of greenhouse gases, whereas before our gases and the heat would be able to dissipate beyond our atmosphere. And now we are capturing that. So not as much of the heat is reflected out into, beyond our atmosphere. And so now we are beginning to slowly actually heat up on Earth. And so the reason that it was called the greenhouse effect is because literally we are looking a bit like this, and the greenhouse are the greenhouse gases. We were for a while calling it global warming, but what we realized is that what's going on is not just uniform warming while the Earth is warming. Some places are going to see climate changes where they'll see extended winter events and other things that are cooling events. But let me just describe also where some of these greenhouse gases are coming from. The major one of most concern is how we're providing energy, how we're continue to be on a fossil fuel-based economy, relying also on the plastics that are petrochemically derived. And that's 35% globally of our greenhouse gases. But you'll see that 11% of our greenhouse gases are coming from the agricultural sector. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. In addition, we have shifted the language so that we are talking about climate change, not global warming, because there was a lot of pushback around that. So as nurses, we know that at 98.6, we are at a comfortable temperature. We're able to flourish, but just a little, a degree or two hotter, and we turn into being fevered. And once we start getting those temperatures up to 101, 102, we are starting to feel really awful. And at 104 and 105, we are starting to see systems break down, especially if we have that over a prolonged period of time. So here's an indication of one of the organisms on Earth, which are humans, that is very, very attentive to and in need of a specific temperature. So what happens if the whole Earth now is moving towards having a fever? What does this mean? And so all of the species on Earth, with the very few exceptions, need water and need air and need food. Some necessitate sunlight. But also what we need to know is species need a particular temperature range. And that includes our plants, and it includes our animals and all the other species in between. And so if we begin to start cooking up a zone where plants have flourished before and are starting to raise the temperature, remember the temperature difference for humans is just a few degrees, and we start to not feel well. Well, we're starting to see that just the climate, just temperatures alone are making shifts, except for it's not just temperatures alone, because once we start to see climate change, we also then see a range of things that are going on, including sea level rises and increased storm activities. And as per today's talk, critical changes in agriculture, which are going to translate to food security issues. We're also seeing increased droughts, which translate to food security issues, and fires. And certainly anybody who's been paying attention, the Brazilian fires are really both contributing to climate change as well as caused in response to a desire to have more land mass for certain kinds of agriculture. We're also seeing increased heat waves, which in addition to affecting the plants, are affecting the farm workers. And we know in the Central Valley of California, which produces a lot of the produce in the United States, that many of the farm workers there who are hesitant to leave their work sites and stop and take breaks and drink enough water, many of them are showing signs of chronic dehydration, which is translating to kidney problems and kidney failure. And then decreased access to water in various, or too much water. And you can see some of the pictures on the bottom are of the Midwest after the prolonged flooding that happened this year. So all of these are contributing to climate change and are the effects of climate change. So what we can anticipate globally are crop failures and associated then malnutrition, expanding into famine. And of course, as always, in this country and around the world, it is always our most vulnerable population that we as nurses recognize are always going to be at the most risk for, you name it, in terms of health outcomes. They're going to be the ones that are going to be most vulnerable to climate change related issues in terms of agriculture. So when we look at climate change and cause and effect, it goes in both directions. And there are certain agricultural practices that cause greenhouse gases. There are certain agricultural practices that actually are going to draw down carbon and that are going to be the solution. And then there are the effects that climate change are having on agriculture. So it's complex. It's important for us to understand. And we're delighted to have Renata Brillinger, who is the executive director and the co-founder of the California Climate and Agriculture Network, CalCAN. But her statewide organization or coalition is also connected to a number of other coalitions and organizations. And their role is to advance state and federal policy to realize the powerful climate solutions that can be offered by sustainable and organic agriculture. And they've been around for 10 years now, and the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments has been around for a little over 10 years. They've been organizing farmers and ranchers, helping to bring their voices to advocacy for keeping agriculture viable in the face of climate change, and also for recognizing that good agricultural practices, and perhaps some new and innovative ones, are going to play an important role in sequestration of carbon, which is going to be helpful in the mitigation. So with that, that's a brief framing, and I hope it's helpful for you. And now I turn things over to Renata, and we are once again just delighted to have you talking with us nurses. So thank you.
Thanks, Barbara, for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for listening in, and those of you who are going to listen after it's recorded. Barbara, that was a great framing for me because it lets me jump right in to some of the background and work with CalCAN. And as I do, I just want to, I guess, say how pleased I am, to have met Barbara a few years ago now, and also some other leaders in the public health arena who recognize how connected all this is. I think healthcare workers generally, and farmers certainly, are systems thinkers. And when we look at climate change, I think it's the ultimate challenge, for us to be figuring out how we're going to tackle this systemic problem with systemic solutions, and not just sort of a reductionistic approach that we humans, and especially in the Western world, tend to take to almost everything we touch. So I think this is a unifying topic. It really naturally lends itself to connecting a lot of dots. So it's partly why I'm pleased to be talking with nurses who recognize those connections. And Barbara, I'll say too, in your framing, you did a really nice job of several times connecting climate impacts to health and well-being, and specifically to the well-being of folks who are socially disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged. Those are the ones who are going to be the most impacted by all these changes that need to be made. So I'll try to weave that through as I go as well. So just a little bit about CalCAN, and to add to Barbara's description, we have been around 10 years, and we are a coalition, and that's a really important component of how we work. We a lot of what we do is in coalition and in partnership with a lot of stakeholders, and we're a pretty small team with a relatively small budget, so we really rely on farmers and ranchers, and other agricultural professionals, and nonprofit advocates, environmentalists, policymakers to do our work, because it really amplifies our messages. And in the case of farmers, they're the folks who really have to be bought in order for us to achieve the benefits that we know are possible, the climate benefits that are possible. So we focus exclusively on policy change, and mainly at the state level, though a little bit also on the Farm Bill. I'll touch on that a little bit later. Our theory is that in order to encourage and support farmers in transitioning towards practices that have climate benefits, they need some support. They need resources. They need good, sound science. They need technical assistance to help with those changes to their operations, and they need some financial incentives in some cases to help overcome the risks of making changes. They're business people, and they need to, as they make these changes, they have to be. We all have to be sure they stay in business to feed us. So we try to use policy as a lever to get those resources in place and in the hands of the right farmers who are the innovators and the leaders. We're very privileged to be working with some of the most skillful farmers that are working in concert with nature to produce food and fiber. So we spend a lot of time in Sacramento with our policy team and our lobbyists, and we also spend a lot of time out in the field, taking policymakers out to learn about farming and taking other partners to hear directly from farmers themselves. In terms of, so I'm gonna have three pieces to this talk, and they sort of mirror Barbara's introduction a little bit. Review the impacts of climate change on agriculture and on all of us. Talk some about the both the contributors to climate change in agriculture and also the solutions or the ways that agriculture can decrease its emissions. And then the third piece will be to focus a little bit on the policy arena. So in terms of impacts, I don't want to spend too long here, but there is a lot to be said about this. There are the agronomic impacts. These are the effects that we're seeing of climate change on our food production system, and they vary a lot region to region. So it's hard to generalize, and they also vary year to year. I mean, I think we should have called it climate chaos because it really is for farmers who rely on some semblance of of history, some historical knowledge and experience. It's very challenging, increasingly challenging to predict when spring's going to come, when the rains are going to stop, when's a good time to plant, temperature wise or rainfall wise. And then they're seeing unpredictable and extreme weather events that make it their already challenging job that much harder. I've talked with new farmers who are extremely, they're coming into the business at a time when it's possibly the hardest time to rely on historical data. And then farmers that have been farming for decades say to us regularly, I've never seen a winter like this, or I've never seen 2 years back to back that are so different, and we just don't know what to do. So they're seeing these extreme events, unprecedented impacts, intensified cycles. Some people call this precipitation whiplash in California as we swing from a drought year to a flood year. They're getting new pests and diseases. Of course, those organisms adapt quickly to changes, so they're ahead of the curve. They're moving into new areas with a lot of rapidity, and farmers are having a hard time keeping up. In California, we grow a lot of fruit and nuts, and a lot of those trees are very vulnerable, or they're very sensitive to needing some cold hours during the winter. And as we see our winters warming, the chill hours that they are exposed to are decreasing, and that's having a bearing on decreased yields. The flowers and the fruit don't set properly each spring if they haven't had enough cold winter hours. And there's a term called subsidence, which is the result of overdrafting groundwater and causing the land to sink. And it's happening dramatically in the Central Valley, where a large amount of the world's of the country's food is produced. They're having this, huge challenges with their infrastructure collapsing as the ground sinks, as when that groundwater table decreases. And then, of course, all of this leads to decreased yields, and that has economic impacts. It has health and food security impacts, and it has social impacts that ripple out in the form of job losses as land is fallowed or yields are decreased. It has an effect on the cost of food. Of course, there's public health impacts of climate change itself, but also the secondary effects of it on the food system. And as Barbara mentioned, farm worker health is a big concern, not just from heat stress, actually, but we saw in the last 2 years here in California the effect of wildfire smoke on the respiratory systems of farm workers. That smoke came from hundreds of miles away in some cases, and it settled in the Central Valley, which kind of tends to contain because of its geomorphology. It contains a lot of pollution, including smoke. So these are big, big issues that are very intractable. So, moving from that bad news, that I'll talk briefly about the contributions that agriculture makes to climate change. There are three um, gases that are the product of well, all human activity, but in agriculture, we've got carbon dioxide emissions that comes mainly from tilling up the soil, which is done for two reasons: to inhibit weed growth and also to loosen up the soil so it's easier to plant into, and the seedlings and seeds can have a purchase in the soil. But that uses fossil fuels, of course, which is and the emissions from the fossil fuel burning contribute carbon dioxide, and then energy in use and fuel use generally on the farm for pumping water, for electricity, for refrigeration, all kinds of impacts on CO2. Methane is a very big problem in agriculture, especially here in California. We have a lot of livestock. We're the number one dairy producing state in the country. So the animals themselves emit methane from their burps and farts, as do all mammals. But there's a lot of cows here, so there's a lot of methane coming out of the animal itself. There's methane coming off of the manure that those animals produce. The traditional way of handling manure here on many non-organic dairies is to flush it out of the stalls, as you can see in that picture, and into these huge manure lagoons where there's no oxygen, there's little circulation, so the methanogenic bacteria that degrade the manure off-gas methane from those big ponds. There's a little bit of methane that comes off of compost production if it's not well turned and oxygenated. And then in rice production, there's quite a bit of methane as well. Again, the result of those rice fields in the winter being flooded and the residue on the ground being broken down and producing methane. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. It's more potent. It traps more heat than carbon dioxide, as does nitrous oxide, even more than methane. Nitrous oxide produces an effect that's much greater at holding in that heat in the atmosphere. And the primary contributor to nitrous oxide in agriculture is the use of nitrogen fertilizer that isn't fully utilized by the plants when it's over-applied, or it's not nearby the plants. Whether it's chemical fertilizers or organic fertilizers, there can be nitrous oxide produced. So those are the main gases. In California, agriculture on farm is estimated to be responsible for 7 to 8% of all of the state's emissions. So I want to move into spend the rest of the time on solutions and on policy. The policies that we're advocating for hopefully unleash more and more of these solutions over time. That's our intention. So this is a pretty big list with a lot that could be said. If you want to dive into more detail or look at some of the scientific citations for any of these, we published a fact sheet about 8 months ago that's on our website in our resources publications list that kind of unpacks this a little bit more. But I'll just give you an overview. The solutions that agriculture can bring forward fall into four main categories. And in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, there are two other important things to know about these solutions. One is that agriculture can actually be a sink for carbon, not just a source of emissions. So the fact that we have that we grow plants on farms is in itself a solution center, because those plants, through photosynthesis, can convert carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into carbon in a different form in the soil, which is an essential building block of all plant growth and health. So this is one of the magical things about Earth, is that these plants pull that pull through oxygen, or sorry, rather using sunlight, convert CO2 into oxygen, and that carbon gets pulled down through the plant and into the soil profile, and it's used and available to microbes and fungi and other microorganisms in the soil that essentially create this very complex carbon cycle. And that's where we want the carbon. It's doing a lot of harm in the in the atmosphere, but in the soil and in plant tissue, it's critical for sustaining all life on Earth. The only other places we can put carbon on Earth that are welcome and healthy are in our forests and our open spaces. We have more carbon than we should in the oceans. The oceans have been a big sink for carbon, and that's leading to a tremendous number of issues with ocean ecosystem health. So really, what we want to do is turn agriculture into a sink for carbon, through using a lot of these practices. The other thing you'll notice about this list as I go through it, and I'm going to go through very quickly, is that there's a lot of co-benefits to these four major categories of agricultural solutions. We get a lot of air and water quality benefits when we make the transition to these practices, and we got a lot of health benefits, environmental health benefits, and benefits to the most impacted communities, who suffer the most from the pollution that traditional agriculture, or conventional agriculture contributes. Improving soil. So I'm going to go through these at a high level. Improving soil health is one of the main places we should be looking to transition our practices. This is done through a number of different techniques that I'll go through in a second. But what improving soil health does is it reduces the reliance of farmers on chemical inputs, and therefore we're getting better air and water quality. It improves the fertility of the soils, because if you've got a healthy soil, you've got a live soil, and if you've got a live soil, you've got the conditions for plant health and productivity, as well as storing carbon. And it also importantly improves the structure of the soil. So the soil becomes a sponge, and it can hold water. It limits erosion, it limits flooding. The soil can actually pull that water down and store it in the groundwater, which at least in California is, and many other parts of the country as well, is in decline and has been unsustainably used over the past several decades. Another big category of tools is to increase biodiversity on farms, and we can do that in a number of ways. Rotating crops, diversifying the types of crops that are grown, planting along roadways and field boundaries and creeks and rivers. We can plant woody non-crop plants. These are plants that flower. They're shrubs and trees. They provide habitat for beneficial insects, for pollinators and natural predators, and they also provide habitat for other creatures, so they can pass through and between farm fields and into open spaces where they live safely. These kinds of plantings improve watershed health generally. They put more carbon both in the plants themselves and also in the soil profile. Improving water and energy efficiency is a really important piece of a climate smart agriculture system. Anytime we use less energy to pump water or do any other activity on farms, we're reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted as a result of producing energy. And this also provides more economic stability for growers, because they'll be less dependent on fossil fuel and increasingly expensive energy and water. And then the last category is farmland conservation. This isn't maybe intuitive, but there is good data showing that the energy intensiveness of agricultural land is much lower than it is in urban areas or suburban areas. The actual energy embedded in the infrastructure is lower. There's fewer buildings, there's fewer vehicle miles traveled, there's less energy use per acre. The estimates are 70 to 100 times more carbon greenhouse gases generally are emitted on 1 acre of urban land compared to 1 acre of farmland or ranch land. So just by preserving farmland and limiting the sprawl in our urban areas, concentrating the growth in existing urban boundaries, that alone makes a really important contribution to climate change. Of course, also protecting that farmland has benefits in terms of continuing to protect this valuable soil and conditions where we grow food. It ensures that we have good economic engine in some of our often poorer rural areas, and that has some co-benefits like catching water. Urban urban land tends to sheet water right off and back into streams and out to the river, but out to the ocean rather. But if you have open soil and cropland and orchards, you actually allow that water to penetrate into the soil and back into the groundwater. And then there's just the sort of benefit of having wildlife habitat, open space for recreational purposes, for just human enjoyment generally. So that's a pretty high overview. We can come back to any of those that you're interested in. I want to just spend the rest of the time, about another 10, 15 minutes, talking about California's fairly unique policy arena where through the use of this cap and trade program that we've got in place, we've really created an economic engine for incentivizing a lot of different greenhouse gas reducing activities. California is arguably the most strong leader, I would say, in the world, or one of the most in the world, in terms of setting goals for greenhouse gas reductions and investing funds in doing that. It's set some very ambitious targets that are going to be challenging to meet, but it has, and it's also rolled out a number of funding programs across the economy, all sectors of the economy, to really help us make this massive transition that needs to be made. So the essence of cap and trade is that it limits how much pollution, how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases can be emitted from the very largest polluters. So this picture here is of a refinery, oil refineries, the biggest industrial consumers of energy, food processing facilities, cement factories, things like that. Those are the industries that are capped, and that cap decreases over time. And if those companies don't reduce their emissions, they get fined. But as those emissions come down, they're also required to essentially pay into this greenhouse gas fund. It's more complicated than that, but suffice to say that the state of California has raised over $8 billion in the last 4 or 5 years through this cap and trade program that the legislature and the governor then distribute in the form of a number of different grants programs for a whole bunch of activities, electrifying vehicles, solar panels, forest restoration, fire prevention, recycling and composting programs, housing, smart growth housing projects, the high-speed rail, bicycle paths, just a lot of different systems that will help us across our whole society bring those emissions down. And agriculture is one of the sectors that has benefited from some of this money. So I'm going to just talk about the 4 programs that we focus on that have been established in the last 4 or 5 years and have benefited from some of the greenhouse gas money, a very small portion, but and not as much as we think is necessary, but at least something where we didn't have anything at all a few years ago to incentivize farmers. So there are 4 programs that have collectively been either spent or budgeted over $350 million so far. More than close to 1,200 grants have now been given out to farmers for voluntarily participating in these programs and agreeing to change some of their farming practices. Those 4, if you'll hear echoes of the solutions that I just talked about a minute ago in these programs, because they all reward those kinds of solutions. The Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation Program is the oldest program, started in 2014, and it funds grants that will permanently protect farmland in perpetuity from sprawl, from suburban and other forms of sprawl. And there have been 124 easements that have been settled, that have been agreed to by farmers around the state who attached essentially to their deed an agreement that that land can never be developed. It always has to stay in farmland, and that helps us collectively by keeping that land in food production and by limiting the sprawl. The farmland that has to be protected under that program is farmland that's at risk of development, that would otherwise perhaps have been paved over. The next program that came online was the one below that on the slide, the SWEEP program. And that program essentially gives grants to farmers for improving their water use efficiency. Things like moving to micro sprinklers, like you see in that picture, improved efficiency in their pumps, solar pumps, equipment that gives farmers the opportunity to more closely monitor the amount of water they're applying, how moist their soil is, weather stations, all kinds of stuff that helps reduce both water and energy use. Obviously important in a state that's arid and dependent on irrigation, not only because of the greenhouse gas impacts, but because we have water scarcity and need to be very carefully constraining how much water is used everywhere. The Healthy Soils program and the AMP program below it are the 2 newest programs. They've only been running for about 2 or 3 grant cycles now. The Healthy Soils program rewards a lot of soil health practices, things like adding compost and cover crops, which is a way to grow off-season crops that add fertility to the soil and pull that carbon down into the soil. Prescribed grazing, the use of cattle and other livestock on land by rotating them intensively through their pastures can add carbon to the soil, both the carbon that's deposited from the animal itself in the manure, but also the action of the animal tilling up that soil and bringing that carbon down into the soil creates conditions that are healthier for the microbes and that produce better forage, better grass, and healthier cows in the long run. And then the Alternative Manure Management Program is a program that gives farmers grants for moving from those manure lagoons I mentioned earlier, where the conditions are anaerobic, towards drier methods for handling the manure, so that they can create compost in the end, and then use that compost on their fields for improving fertility and decrease how much nitrogen fertilizer is used. So that has a whole bunch of co-benefits that come with it. So those are 4 programs. There's a lot of complexity to them all, but I just wanted to give you an overview of them. In California, we've got a relatively new governor. He hasn't even been in office, 10 months yet. Governor Newsom. Governor Brown before him is the person that whose administration we worked closely with to get those 4 programs I just described on the ground and working. Governor Newsom, very early in his term, came out with a lot of support for the concept of healthy soils and for the program itself, He wasn't even 3 weeks in office when he delivered this quote about healthy soils being a passion of his. And he followed that up with doubling the budget of the Healthy Soils program a few months later. He and the legislature came to that agreement when we finished the last budget cycle. So this gives us a lot of encouragement, that will our way forward in as advocates for agricultural climate solutions will be well received in the governor's office. There is some work yet to do, though. It's more complicated than just stating that you have a passion for healthy soils. There are other programs that are needed, the ones I just mentioned, and just having a passion is insufficient. We need to see the money following, and we need the programs to be well designed, and we need the programs to reach a wide diversity of farmers. So those are some of the things that CalCAN continues to drill down on. Is the devil in the details about how this is all going to work. So I'll just wrap up by saying that I sort of said at the beginning, but I want to say again how important it is for us in our success that we work closely with a broad cross section of partners. Farmers and ranchers are the backbone of our work. They're the ones who we really rely on to ground truth what we're pushing forward. Is this going to matter? Are you going to be able to do this? How's it really work on the ground? Where do we need to put the policy pressure? The farmers work with us as spokespeople, and they come in and testify, and they meet with their representatives. They're models. We tell their stories as much as possible about what's working and what's not working. We bring people out to see the leaders and how they're doing it. We also work with advocates in the environmental justice arena, trying to improve constantly on our focus on how important it is to ensure that these programs are serving the most vulnerable, whether it's farm workers or rural communities or people who eat food and need to, and are struggling maybe to pay for good food. And then we rely a lot on scientists and on nonprofit partners to amplify our work and to kind of connect us with other interested stakeholders. So in terms of nurses and the healthcare field generally, it's we've been in conversation with some leaders in this space, including Barbara. Public Health Institute is another example. I think there's a lot more conversation there to be had to really strengthen the connections, to make explicit the connections between what we're trying to do with farmers and what nurses who are trying to care for people's urgent health needs. How we can think together about building more political power, and how we can think together about strengthening the messages about how these things are all connected and how we'll get so many benefits if we shift, our economy in a clean, green direction, and specifically how we shift our agricultural system away from a chemically intensive, high tech, monoculture approach to one that's grounded and rooted in biology and in knowledge systems of farmers and in working within the constraints of our natural resources as opposed to just sort of struggling and fighting against them. So that's the vision we hold. And I look forward to questions now and ongoing dialogue about thoughts you have about how to better describe all these connections and then drive this this vision into being, into realizing it with policy and financing. So I think I'll stop there. If you're interested in following our work, we have a blog and we have a monthly newsletter. It's not too burdensome, I think, although all of us, I think, struggle with email volume. But if you are interested in checking out more on our website or through following us on our blog or newsletter, there's the information for you. So thanks again, Barbara, for inviting me into this.
Oh, just wonderful. Thank you so much. And so what I'd like to let our attendees know is that regrettably, we cannot incorporate your voices into the program. However, each of you have a chat box, and you can make comments or ask questions in the chat box. So please do that at this point. If this was of interest to you, if there are some things that were not, or I started to talk about here, but you'd like to hear more about, we're open to continuing to have the monthly series so that we can cover all of the subject matter that you're interested in. And I don't see anything right this minute, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that came up for me. But Kara, if you'll keep an eye on the chat box too. So we have people from all over the country who are listening right now, and I was wondering if you could let us know about what other states or what other organizations, for those who are not in California, how they might additionally plug in. And I'd certainly encourage people to go to your website because it's got information that is generalizable around this issue area. But are there other states that you also network with?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I forgot also to mention anything about the Farm Bill, so I can weave that in here maybe.
Yes.
And maybe I'll start. Yeah.
Next.
Your other question?
No, I said that was our next question.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll start there just because the Farm Bill has national impact, regardless of where each state is at with its progress on climate change. The Farm Bill is a huge bill that's debated every 4 years or so. And then every year there are debates over how to actually fund it. But it's important because it has two primary pieces to it. One is health and nutrition, and things like the WIC program, Women, Infant, Children Funding Program, food stamps, school food, sort of on that side of things. But also there's a lot of money budgeted for on-farm practices that have environmental benefits. So these two, as well as some of the stuff we at least at CalCAN wish wasn't so highly subsidized, which are the subsidies for the big commodity crops, that soy and corn and so on. So it's a kind of a complicated topic, but what I want to say about it is that it funds the country's largest conservation program we have, which is a program called the National Resources Conservation Service. And this program spends hundreds of millions of dollars every year on farms, improving the environmental stewardship practices of those farmers. Again, another grants program. And in that program is a set of practices that are very consistent with those that we're rewarding here in California, that improve soil health and biodiversity, as well as manure management and all the things we just talked about. So that program exists, and every state has access to those grants as we speak. So that's an important thing to know. It's a constant struggle to make sure there's enough money in those programs and to make sure that the programs continue to improve over time. And but it is at least a nexus for states where they don't have a cap and trade program like California, or perhaps don't have the same level of receptivity around addressing climate change. And then, as Barbara said, there's a lot of states in the country that are trying to figure out how to address climate change generally. And then there are some where you can't talk about climate change at all. It really isn't politically palatable, especially with farmers. So in those places, we're sort of networked with some organizations that are trying to figure out how to approach the subject without talking about climate change. And one good avenue they've found is for talking about healthy soils. That really seems to be resonating right now with a lot of farmers and ranchers, because there's so many values to their business by improving soil, improving fertility, improving resilience. I didn't even talk about resilience much, but healthy soils makes soils and plants more resilient to the impacts of climate change and other vagaries of the weather. So we're part of a somewhat informal network of other farmer-centered organizations, about a dozen states, that they're listed on our website. But the essentially what we're trying to do is stay in conversation with each other to share lessons learned, best practices in the policy space about how to move forward on legislation that incentivizes soil health improvements on farms. Not necessarily even talking about climate change, but knowing that that's, of course, one of the many benefits of improving soil health. There are a number of states that have passed bills that put in place healthy soils programs. Some of them are just in theory. They don't have any funding. A few others have got some modest funding. But it's, I see Joe has a question here about other states passing legislation like California. I think that is the healthy soils bills and programs are the only consistent example of states where there are other where there's something similar to what's happening here. And I haven't seen any states that sufficiently fund water conservation or farmland protection. Some of the states that have got a healthy soils program in place right now are New York, New Mexico, kind of interesting contrast there, Vermont. There's Hawaii has got something. There's a scatter plot, and then there are a lot of others that are thinking about or sort of progressing towards getting a program in place. The hard part is it's hard enough to get a program in place. It's even harder to get it funded, and that's where we're seeing a gap to some extent in realizing the potential of those programs.
There are several other questions that you're being asked here, and so I'm going to start from the top, at least the order that I have it. So are there specific crops that are more efficient at trapping carbon?
Generally speaking, the deeper rooted and the more complex the roots of a crop, the more carbon can be drawn down into from the atmosphere. So orchard crops, vineyards, they have big woody and complex root structures. Row crops, ones that are just annual, that just get harvested for 3 to 5 months after they're planted, that they tend to deplete carbon because they're shallow rooted. They get harvested and eaten. They don't leave any residue behind. So that's a general answer to that question. It's much more complicated than that, but that's probably the best I can do in the time we have.
Sure, and I'm going to just add a question to that, which is the notion of moving towards more perennial crops, away from annuals, and maybe you could describe the difference to our audience.
Yeah, so an annual crop is one that's harvested every year, planted and harvested every year. It's fairly, intensive, energy intensive to produce lettuce and strawberries and corn, things like that. Perennial crops are crops that stay in the ground for more than a year. That can be anything from artichokes to asparagus to tree crops, trees and nuts and fruits. There's some folks looking at some indigenous crops that are perennial. I don't think we'll ever aspire to move entirely towards perennial crops, but they have a really important role to play in our food system and in climate solutions generally.
Great. And so there's another question about, and this always comes up, grass-fed cows. How do they compare to grain-fed cows in terms of methane emissions? And anything else you'd like to say about those two?
Yeah, this is a really important area, and it's compromised to answer that question a little bit because the science is still coming in, and it's very site specific. It's very specific to the way that cows are managed. So at the risk of oversimplifying here, I'll try to give a little bit of an answer. It's also it's challenging to measure how much gases come off of cows, just scientifically speaking, because they do sometimes put cows in these chambers and collect all the gases, or they'll attach these very uncomfortable looking devices to them to try to, you can imagine trying to do that on both ends of the cow. But that's very artificial sort of settings for the cows to be in. So there's a lot of debate about exactly what is the connection between what the cow's eating and how gaseous they are. And that's true in humans too. I mean, different humans and different feed, um, different forms of food. It's hard to make generalizations. Um, we also have to be thoughtful about the whole life cycle. I think this is a piece that often gets missed. So we want to know exactly how much, to the extent we can, how much gas is coming off of the animal, how much energy is going into producing the feed that they're eating, and then how much carbon sequestration potential is there if they're grass fed in the on their pastures. And there's a lot. I mean, it's safe to say that well grazed cattle and other livestock can improve soil fertility and soil health if they're well grazed, and that's a big if. If they're grazed in a way that degrades the soil health and overgrazes the forage, then there's no life in the soil, and then we don't get sequestration. If they're carefully managed so that they're getting well fed and they're not overgrazing, just the right amount, and they're moved through those pastures fairly quickly, that can actually see improved carbon sequestration. So that whole calculation, that whole life cycle analysis needs to be done. And it needs to be done in different regions because it depends how much rain there is and what the type of forage is. So I'm going to resist the temptation to answer the question because the answer is it depends. I think the important thing is for us to think about systemically is how to get the answers to those questions, and then how to reward in any given place the combination, that serves the farmer, serves the animal, and serves the environment the best.
Great, thank you for that, and thanks for not giving us a simple answer, because the fact is that it's not, and that the variables and how we study lots of things in environmental health are complicated. There are lots of different inputs, and so I appreciate that. So Janice tells us that in Missouri, they are under what she is saying, aggressive push to bring large CAFOs or concentrated animal feed organizations or operations into their state. And she goes on to say, being a poor state, it is being sold as an economic gain, but many of us see it as an environmental nightmare. Is this program available to present to small groups in our local community to enhance understanding of alternatives to CAFO practices? And if not, CalCAN, are there some other, this is me now speaking, are there some other recommendations for who they might get a good information from around CAFOs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, a big, big issue in agriculture, as Janice says, responsible for a lot of different environmental harms and health harms for the people who live in those areas. It is a complicated subject. So in California, our AMP program, the Alternative Manure Management Program, it doesn't tackle CAFOs per se. You could still have a large, animal operation and improve your manure management practices. But it helps with some of the consequences of producing food that way. There's a similar program in New York State that, at least right now, mainly funds something called anaerobic digesters, which are installed over the manure lagoons, and they capture the methane, so prevent it from going into the atmosphere and convert it to biogas or biofuel. However, that doesn't do anything to address any other environmental harm, and it effectively subsidizes those CAFOs in staying in business. So that's complicated. CalCAN doesn't oppose anaerobic digesters, but we have a lot of concerns about them. They're expensive, they're very high tech, et cetera, et cetera. So there are these little places where some attempts are being made to mitigate the harms of those big CAFOs. And as Janice says, it's really difficult, especially in the dairy industry, as a dairy producer to resist the pressure to get bigger and supposedly more efficient. And a lot of those middle-sized growers are going out of business because they can't compete, and then they usually end up getting consolidated into a larger business. So it's I think anyone who's seeing a sales pitch about getting bigger in livestock operations is they're not the advantages that are being touted are not actually being fully considered in the scheme of things. But it is extremely difficult for those growers to resist. As far as sources for more a better understanding of CAFOs or their alternatives, there are a couple of organizations I would point you to. I mean, our work is very specific to that one AMP program. We don't have a sort of cohesive analysis or critique of CAFOs generally, but I would refer you to the Center for Food Safety. They're based in California, but they're a national organization, and they have done a lot of work on fighting CAFOs. And they're a member of a coalition, Animal Welfare Coalition, and I think that's what they're Animal Reform Coalition, I think is what they're called, ARC. And I think you could find them through going to the Center for Food Safety. So that's probably the place to start, centerforfoodsafety.org, and you'll probably find a treasure trove of information there.
And I think Food and Water Watch in some states have been doing some work in this area too, and the policies. So we are now 1 minute over, and so thank you all for staying with us. This has been absolutely fabulous. Please let your friends and colleagues know that this will be archived, and they will be able to pull it up and watch and listen to this if you want to share this wealth of information with others. Everybody who's registered will be receiving an evaluation tomorrow. For those of you who want to get the 1 unit of continuing nursing education. And the other thing I'd like to just say is we've put this together, this webinar series, as a way of front loading what I'm hoping will become an Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments committee or work group that will be working on food and agriculture through a health perspective. And so stay tuned. We'll probably be starting monthly calls on that to decide how we can distill all this information we've been learning and figure out how we can prioritize the way that nurses can help build healthy, sustainable, and accessible good foods for everybody. And I'd like to thank Renata. I know how busy your schedule is, for taking the time to talk to nurses about this incredibly important topic. And thank everybody for joining us. And thank you, Kara, for helping to be the organizer here. And with that, I'm going to ask Kara to close.